DProf is Genevieve Bell's proper title. It stands for Distinguished Professor. It's totally appropriate to have a rap name when you spend time interpreting the cutting-edge dilemmas of our time in the most humane ways, from the most humane angles. Professor Bell is a cultural anthropologist. Her work is described as the intersection of cultural practice and technology development. After a fortuitous conversation in a US bar in the 90s, she spent almost 2 decades working in Silicon Valley with Intel, advising on user experience, practice and strategy. After she was enticed to return to Australia early last year to head the 3A, Autonomy Agency and Assurance Institute at ANU, and to take the Florence Violet Mackenzie Chair, named after Australia's pioneering first female electrical engineer, she made the essence of her work genuinely accessible via the ABC's Boyer Lectures series. Professor Bell will speak for about half an hour, 40 minutes today, and then we'll have a brief Q&A, and we'll field some of your excellent questions that you'll be formulating during that time. In the spirit of disrupted ideas, she'll be speaking about artificial intelligence and asking us to hit refresh on our interpretation of its meaning and capability. Please welcome Distinguished Professor Genevieve Bell.
All right, no pressure then. It's my favourite kind of introduction. I realise I'm the last thing between you and the end of the day. I realise many of you have been here for hours, so well done. I have at least one Aslan signer I've already frightened, so I'm going to work on the second one for that too. It is my incredible privilege to be here. I have to confess it's the first time I've been to Perth. I came to Western Australia a number of times as a child, but only accidentally. I can say that as someone who grew up in the Northern Territory where going across the border wasn't always obvious. So I want to acknowledge that I'm on the land of people whose country I've never been on before. It's always nice to get to say that you're on Aboriginal country. As Meri said, I've spent 30 years living overseas in America where they never acknowledge that they're on Aboriginal country, and where it is always shocking to me to realise that they are, of course, on country that has been occupied, not as long as ours, but at least for 10,000 years. And whilst we sometimes blow through that as a ritual, I think there's something really powerful in acknowledging that we stand on country that's been occupied for 60 to 80,000 years, and we are in the place that has had the longest continuous cultural activity. And there's something about that that's really important when we go to talk about the future, that we should talk both about where we've come from and where we're going, and those shouldn't be disconnected conversations. It shouldn't be about that we were once something and are now something else, but those are conversations that should thread together. So it's nice to be home, and it's nice to get to say I'm on Aboriginal country. And it's nice to get to talk about something kind of naughty, which is actually to try and think about how do we have a conversation about artificial intelligence from a slightly different point of view. I wanted to take advantage of the fact that I was at a festival that had disrupted in its title to think that maybe there was a different way into this conversation. And what I really want to do is think about how we might talk about the age of AI from a slightly different perspective. I have to add the caveat at the front here. This is a first-time conversation for me, so there's a lot of questions and not a lot of answers. So you should think this is less a canned presentation and more possibly a meditation or a provocation about the nature of new technology, art and creativity. So Meri did a lovely job in giving me a context, and I don't need to say much more to it except to add a couple of pieces, which is when I start to talk about technology, I'm going to sound like an American. And that's because I learned that entire vocabulary in Silicon Valley. But I'm actually a child of Australia. I was born in Sydney, I grew up in Melbourne and Canberra, and spent most of my childhood in an Aboriginal community 350 kilometres north of Alice Springs. I grew up in a place called Alikarang with the Walprik, Kaitich, Alyara and Warramungu people, and then I spent much of my childhood living in other Indigenous communities in Australia. That was a long time ago in a very different childhood. It meant that I spent my time speaking an Aboriginal language. Mum doesn't like it when I say it, but I didn't go to school terribly often. I got to go hunting and gathering every day and kill a lot of things and promptly eat them. And I didn't have to wear shoes. It was basically best childhood ever. And it's an incredibly long way from my mother's field sites in Central Australia to America, but I ran away from home. I went to the US for my university degrees. I ended up at Stanford, and as Meri said, in the late 1990s, I was on the faculty at Stanford University teaching Native American studies and feminist theory. You can see how I would get a job at Intel. Almost obviously, that is just the kind of person they were looking for in the late 1990s. But the reality is, I did in fact meet a man in a bar, because all Australian stories start that way. I met a man in a bar in Palo Alto in the late 1990s, and he was American, which means that will make sense of the next sentence, because his first question to me in the bar was, "What do you do?" Sigh. I said I was an anthropologist. He said, "What's that?" I said I studied people. He said, "Why?" I said I thought they were interesting. He went, At this point, I should have known he was an engineer. Sadly. He asked me what I did with that. I said I was a professor. And he said, "Couldn't you do more?" And I thought, yes, I could stop talking to you. Which I did. And so it was astonishing when he called me at my house the next day, because my mother, who was a very sensible woman as well as a pioneering anthropologist, made it very clear to me you shouldn't give your number to strange men in bars, and so I hadn't. So the fact that he called me at home is kind of remarkable and possibly stalkerish, because we're talking 1998, before Facebook, before Tinder, before Twitter, before LinkedIn, even before Google. So there was not a white box on the internet into which you could type red-headed Australian anthropologist. If you type that into Google today, red-headed Australian anthropologist, the first search term that comes back is my name. So I've done something good in the last 20 years, learned how to thwart the algorithms. But 20 years ago, Bob, as he was known, called every anthropology department in the Bay Area looking for a red-headed Australian. And Stanford University said, "Do you mean Genevieve? Would you like her home phone number?" This is in the years before privacy, clearly. Anyway, Bob called me, offered me a job. I told him I had a job, because I had a job that I liked. He then said the magic words, for those of you still young enough to remember this, which was, he said, "I'll buy you lunch." And there is a moment when you are freshly out of university that you realise you will still work for free food. So I had lunch with Bob. Ultimately, I didn't take his job offer, but he introduced me to a whole lot of people in Silicon Valley, and I met the people at Intel who also attempted to offer me jobs. And I kept telling them no, because I had a job I really liked. I was a professor. I was getting to teach Native American studies. It was pretty good. And after a 7-month protracted courtship with Intel, I realised that saying no to Intel might not have been such a smart move. That in fact, whilst it was a company where they couldn't describe what I would do in my day-to-day job, it was also a company that was making the future. They were making the building blocks of the internet back in 1998. And my mum's an anthropologist, but my dad and both my grandfathers are engineers. And I was pretty certain you shouldn't leave them in charge of building the future. And so the fact that Intel was willing to give me a job, sight unseen, without a job description, had seemed foolish for a protracted period of time, but suddenly became a moment of realizing that that might be an opportunity. That there might be something that an anthropologist, and indeed a self-proclaimed feminist, which I had told them in the job description, when they asked me if there's anything else they needed to know about me, I said I was a radical feminist and an unreconstructed neo-Marxist. It was 1998. And they said quietly, "Do you think we'll like that?" And I thought, you have no idea. So when I decided to take the job, I knew I was taking it against a blank slate, right? They didn't know what an anthropologist could do, and I didn't know what I could do there. But I knew that there was a reason to think that the social sciences and humanities had a place inside companies that built technology. That it shouldn't just be about what's technically possible, but about what people care about. And that people who were good at talking about what people cared about were people like me. And so I took the job. I went to Intel. My new boss sat me down on my second day in the office and said, "We're very excited that you're here. We need your help with 2 things here at Intel." And I said, "Okay, what are those things?" She said, "Well, the first thing we need your help with is women." And I went, okay, which women? And she said, all women. And I'm like, what, all 3.2 billion women? And she went, yep. Excellent. What do you want me to do with 3.2 billion women? I cheerfully said. And she said, it would be good if you could explain to us what they want. And I thought, okay, sure. So in my notebook of the day, I wrote down women all and underlined that and tried to imagine the project I would do that would explain what women wanted to a semiconductor manufacturer. And then I realized there was a dangling number 2 on my piece of paper after the number 1. And I wondered what that would be. Because if your first task is explain women all, it is a little frightening to imagine what the new boss thinks number 2 should be. I think I secretly hoped it would be men. Because then the sum of all humanity would have been mine. But no, my new boss says, listen, we have an ROW problem here at Intel. And of course, I had a problem that I didn't know what the acronym stood for. So I said, what does ROW stand for? And my new boss said, rest of world. And I took a deep breath and thought, I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to have to ask anyway. I said, so where's world, such that there is something described as rest of it? And she said, oh, that's really easy. That's America. And then there's the rest of the world. And we're very excited because you come from there. At which point I realized I could have a job forever. And indeed I have. Because my job has always been, how do you explain people to people who make technology? How is it that you bring what it is that we are, not just consumers, but citizens and human beings and cultural people, and what are the things that we care about, what frustrates us, what motivates us, what do we care about? How do all of those things become a starting place for technology? That means I've been in a lot of conversations with engineers and computer scientists and marketers and business development people for the last 20 years. And I've spent a lot of time talking about how technology is about productivity and efficiency gains and new categories of work and new categories of jobs. And that's the thing I can talk a lot about, but it's not what I want to talk about now, because I actually think there's a different conversation we could and should be having. And it's a conversation about wonder. Because here's the thing. We spend a lot of time making metrics for technology that are about efficiencies and productivities. But the reality is some of the most important technologies of the last 100 years were technologies that told us stories, that made spectacles, that connected us to other people and let us tell stories. Most important technologies of the 20th century were probably things like the radio and television and electricity. And yeah, those weren't necessarily technologies that solely focused on making us productive or efficient. They were technologies about other things. So what if it was possible to say maybe the way of thinking about the role of technology isn't just about what it does to the economy? It's not about what it does for businesses and enterprise, but maybe it's also about a whole series of other human expressions and emotions. Maybe it's about what should technology do for our storytelling, for our creative sector, for the arts, for wonder. Then you're stuck with thinking about how do you define wonder. And I'm old-fashioned that way. When I need to define something, I still go to the Oxford English Dictionary. And those are the definitions from the Oxford English Dictionary. The wonder is about a feeling of amazement or admiration caused by something beautiful, remarkable, or unfamiliar. And those are 3 very different notions, right? Maybe wonder's sometimes about beauty and difference, but it's also about things we don't entirely know how to recognize. It can also be a desire to know something, to feel curious, or to feel doubt. Those are interesting notions to think about inside the context of new technologies, inside the context of any technologies. Of course, they're also things that we have used technology to do repeatedly over the years. And I just wanted to pick one example, and it's actually the photo that's in the backdrop here. That's a photo of the most recent production of The Tempest that took place at the Royal Shakespeare Company in Stratford-on-Avon in November of 2016. The creative director at the Royal Shakespeare Company partnered with Intel, my sometimes company, and with the Imaginarium, the people that did the computer graphics inside Lord of the Rings and who do real-time motion capture for Gollum, you will remember. But we used all of that technology to make the Tempest. And for those of you who remember the Tempest from high school, I'm thinking, it's Shakespeare's last play. It's really trippy. It's a very strange play at multiple levels. And had Shakespeare been alive in the 21st century, he would have thought that VR, AI, digital projection technology was about the best thing ever. And in fact, we put it all into the play. The Globe in Stratford was kitted out with real-time motion sensors. We had 25 cameras in the round. We had Ariel inside a full motion body suit. We were doing motion capture in real time and projecting an Ariel avatar in real time. Ariel flew every night and twice on Saturdays. We used digital projection technology to create the cloven oak tree that he's trapped in on the island. We had projection cameras using an algorithm to create the hounds that race across the back of the island, barking madly. It was an extraordinary experience. There were 4 servers in the theatre the nights that we opened. There was more computational power in that theatre than there usually is keeping the space shuttle in orbit. And it was all being used to make magic. It was being used to change the way you felt about seeing that story played. Ariel flew. The actor who played Ariel stopped walking like a human being. The actor who was Prospero said he every night came on stage and knew he was going to bring a world into existence that couldn't exist in any other way. And that's always the promise of theatre. But it's also a way of thinking about what technology can do that's unexpected. It's not just about how do we make a more efficient factory or office, it's also about how do we make something wonderful. So what would that look like if you applied it to artificial intelligence? Well, you'd have to do a couple of things first. One, you'd need to back yourself out of the mild hysteria that sort of conversations that surround artificial intelligence. Think killer robots, well, just think killer robots. You don't really need to go any further than that. One of the challenges we have whenever we talk about artificial intelligence is that there is no single definition that everyone agrees to. But if I say AI or artificial intelligence, you all nod and go, mm-hmm. You heard an entire panel about it earlier, you all went, mm-hmm. If you'd asked the 4 of us that were on stage and our moderator to define it, you would have had at least, I suspect, 7 definitions. Were I to poll the audience right now, I would find a similar diversity of definitions. Because it turns out the thing about AI is that it has existed in science fiction longer than it existed in science fact, and all kinds of people use it to do different things. So if you had to define it, how would you? Well, I think the most useful way you can define it is to go back to the moment the term was coined, which is in an academic conference in America in 1956, when a group of mathematicians, logicians, and philosophers gathered at Dartmouth College to craft a research agenda about what to do with increasing computational power. So in 1956, computers were 10 years old. The first computer had gone live in Philadelphia in 1946. It was called the ENIAC. It was probably the size of, from me back to that cameraman. It took 135 kilowatts of power. That's like all the power, basically. It ran about 1 kilobit of microprocessor power for that trade-off. So basically about a millionth of a cell phone to a billionth of a cell phone. Not really useful. You also couldn't program it. It was a fixed computational object. If you wanted to change what it did, you had to rearrange the pieces, which, given that the entire thing weighed 30 tons, was an interesting adventure. And in Philadelphia, they knew when you were computing at the ENIAC because the power across town flickered. But between 1946 and 1956, what computers could do had changed dramatically. They became more powerful, they became smaller, the underlying technology changed, and it was a 10-year period of remarkable growth. And so for a whole bunch of scientists, they sat around going, well, listen, if computers can get that much more powerful in 10 years, what are they going to do in the next 10? And how will we leverage all of that? And so they became convinced that the most important way to think about that was to imagine that computers were less like calculators and becoming more like brains. And of course, the only brain they cared about in 1956 was the human brain. And so they sat down and said, okay, well, if computers are going to be like brains, what should the research agenda look like? And I have to write this down because I can never remember all of it because I'm old. But in 1956, this is what they said. So this was their research agenda. They said, the study is to proceed on the basis of the conjecture that every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence can in principle be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. So any feature of intelligence can be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. Bold. They then go on to say there's 4 things that they really think that should be. They go, we're going to find out how to make machines use language, by which they didn't mean programming languages, obviously, they meant human languages. Use languages, form abstractions and concepts, solve kinds of problems now reserved for humans, and improve themselves. That was the sum total of artificial intelligence in 1956. But the notion was that we could describe what made humans intelligent with such detail that you could make a machine do it. Now, there's a whole lot of problems with that notion. Who gets to describe what is human intelligence? What's the machine that's going to simulate it? What are you leaving out? And whose theory of human intelligence might you be relying on? And it turns out, in 1956, the theory they were relying on was from Skinner. Those of you who don't know him, American behavioralist, has the really helpful attribute in this particular conversation that he believed that humans were basically a machine, electrical impulses in, electrical impulses out. So if you're a bunch of philosophers and mathematicians wanting a theory of humans that you can make into a machine, having a behavioral psychologist who thinks that humans are just like machines is really helpful. And so the notion here was, could you discern what the inputs were in order to work out what the outputs would be? Problem statement number 1. Problem number 2 is that what it meant to talk about human intelligence in 1956 was narrow band. Only certain people were seen to be intelligent. Intelligence was seen to be a very particular set of things. And a research agenda was set then that has persisted ever since. There have been waves of funding, there have been waves of research, there have been different players involved, but ultimately AI is still chasing the same goals. Understand language, handle abstractions, do things that are reserved for humans, learn. But if you were to define artificial intelligence in 2018, you'd probably actually say it was about 5 different pieces of technology that sit underneath that label, or not so much technologies as things. Because the biggest change between 1956 and 2018 when it comes to talking about artificial intelligence is the preponderance of data. Effectively, you now have the ability to precisely describe things because we have all the data, or at least a whole lot more data than we used to have. But as you would have heard in a couple of panels earlier today, one of the problems with data is, well, it's data. The best way to think about that is probably that data is AI's original sin. It is always complicated, it is always partial, it is never complete. And that everything is then built on that piece of precise description. So AI includes data, it includes algorithms, so the mechanism by which that data is made in some sort of sense. AI also includes mechanisms by which the system can learn over time, so learning techniques. It includes sensing technologies, so how will the system gain new data beyond the data it's primed with? So how will it learn about the world about it and around it? And then last but by no means least, what is effectively the logic by which that system is operating? What is the principle? What is the strategy? What is the reason? What's the cortex? So 5 things. Lots of ways of thinking about those 5, but I thought it might be interesting to take each one of those and say, what if we were to imagine that was in the service not of creating new jobs and new economies, but making wonder? Where would that get us? Well, let's just start with data, right? If you think about data as being constantly retrospective and usually something that can be converted into a mechanism that a computational object could understand, that's a little hard to think about data and art that way, right? Except we can certainly think about data in the humanities. There's a great deal of work happening inside the Australian National University, UTS, Rutgers in America, University of Alberta, Trinity College in Dublin, where there are centres of excellence with people using data to solve humanities problems. So can you take the entire corpus of Shakespeare and start to analysing it, use computers to find new patterns? Can we use computer vision to look at art and work out if that really is a Van Gogh or if it's just a really neat copy? Can we use patterns in the data to ask new questions? And some of those questions are hard. I have a colleague of mine who's been using the data about funding of Australian movies to determine that men get more money than women do. You probably didn't need an algorithm to tell you that, but the data's pretty comprehensive. So the data then starts to say, are there other people who should be making art? Would be one way of doing it. Caltech, so #1 university usually ranked in the world, has a conceptual artist on their faculty. His job is to help physicists and other scientists see the world differently. When he first was employed there, he took the physics department to the local museum and made them stand in front of Monet to understand how Impressionists used colour and light as a way of thinking differently about how they were presenting their charts and data. He now works to help them think about how to imagine the world differently. There's an artist in Japan who, possibly my favourite data representation activity recently, hacked a Roomba, so the robotic vacuum cleaners, and he turned the dust sucking activity into paint blowing activity. And so it runs around on the floor making art, or at least making a mess, depending on how you feel about it, but then the algorithm is the thing that's being visualised, right? Of course, it's also the case that one of the ways that artists and creatives have historically looked at data is not to find the patterns, but to find the odd things, the things that stick out, the things that aren't the patterns, the disruptions. So imagining how we might use an artistic eye to train a machine, not to see the patterns, but to see the distinctions, would be a completely different way of thinking about how to use data. It might not be about the things that are the same, but about the things that are different. Or about seeing different kinds of patterns. If you go to a gallery and look at art, or you look at different kinds of art, there are different ways of imagining what a pattern might be and how you might make sense of it. And of course, if you imagine that was true, you would then start to think about where that data might lead you differently. So algorithms always seems like a scary word, but the thing about an algorithm is you've all encountered them long before computers came along. If you had a washing machine and you have ever used it, there was a setting on your washing machine at some point called either delicate, dark, or wool. Not first generation washing machines, I'm talking things from the 80s. If you identified and picked that cycle, the washing machine knew that you needed cold water, low agitation, 1 spin, 1 rinse. And it just went, okay. And you couldn't override that. You couldn't say, actually, I'd like my wool to be felted. Because if you did that, it wasn't the wool cycle anymore. That's an algorithm. All it did was say, here is a sequence of events that we can automate without you needing to select all of them in advance. It's all an algorithm does. It automates a series of tasks and determines that they are related to one another and should appear in a particular sequence. Washing machines have them, microwave ovens have them, cars have them. It turns out computers have them too. There's, strictly speaking, a couple of ways of making algorithms. You can make them as a human being, deciding, like the wool cycle, that certain things follow certain things. You can also make them letting the data make the relationships. So feed a computational object enough data, it will work out that there are certain kinds of relationships. There are 2 ways of doing that too, what's either called supervised or unsupervised learning. So basically, offer a computational object a data set and tell it what the result should be, and then let it find the pattern to fit that result. Think of it a bit like rote learning from school. Or unsupervised learning where you say, there's a pattern, go find it. Those are complicated algorithms, right? But the reality is most of us encounter computational algorithms a great deal of the time too. If you use ABC's iView, if you've downloaded the ABC Listen app, if you have used Netflix or Google or almost anything else I can think of, you have encountered the classic form of algorithms, which are usually algorithms of recommendation. So all they say is, if you like this thing, you'll like that thing too. If you liked that movie, you will like these other movies because they are by the same director. And here are all the other things she did. Maybe you liked it because of that actor. Here are all the other things she's in. Maybe you liked it because of the location. Here are other things that happened there. All it's doing is working out what's the thread to pull of the thing that is the same. Here's the challenge with that class of algorithms. It's the thing that's the same. And I'm willing to bet for most of us in the room, there is a great deal of comfort in things that are familiar. Comforting familiar food, that's why we call it that. Clothes that you know every time you put them on you feel okay. The same way home, because you know how to do it without really blinking. That one meal that's always your go-to meal. That one television show that you'll put on because it's good to have the TV on, but you're not really watching it, but it's deeply comforting, right? We all know what that feels like. That's familiar. Familiar is deeply seductive. Imagine a world, however, where you never get to have anything but the familiar. And here's the thing, most of us, as much as we like the familiar, there's also this kind of sequence that goes familiar, 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 trending to bored, familiar, desperately hoping someone will give us something else to do, something completely different. That's a not uncommon sequence. The challenge is most recommendation engines can only do the familiar, 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 God forbid you get bored. Because it just keeps serving up things that are like the thing that you are looking at, and indeed sometimes even more like the thing you are looking at, more extreme versions of that same thing. The reality is, however, for most of us, particularly in the content space, so movies, film, food, fashion, occasionally we like to be surprised. We like to encounter something we haven't encountered before. It's very hard to do that in the world of algorithms as currently constituted. They are, by their nature, in fact, quite conservative, and with a propensity to just keep us in the same domain we've been in. So what would it be like to architect an algorithm that didn't do that? Now, the trick here is, of course, it would need to be idiopathic. It would need not to do the same thing over and over again, right? There's no point having an algorithm that surprises you every time. That ceases to be surprising and just becomes irritating. Or becomes familiar, which see above. But imagine the algorithm, and I will use myself as a terrible example of this. I like my coffee. I try not to have it on days when I have Aslan translators, because it's mean. And I'm trying really hard. Thank you, good, good. And that makes me feel good because I like coffee. And I haven't had any since 8 a.m. But here's the thing, when I come to a new town, I look up on Google where there is good coffee, usually where there is good coffee that is open, because that's often a criteria too. And Google can usually tell me it's open, how far it is away, sometimes a rating. And I take the little map and off I go. It would be an interesting thing to imagine that same algorithm saying, yeah, Genevieve, we know you need coffee. Yeah, sure. But if you go over the bridge, down James, and take a right on Grand Lane, not only will you find coffee, but there's street art there and it's beautiful. And if you keep going a little bit, you'll find something called Art 140, and you can walk across the entire of the Perth CBD looking at pieces of art. And maybe you'll find coffee too. Now imagine something that didn't trade entirely on efficiencies and entirely on serving me up exactly what I wanted, but said maybe this is a moment where you should look at a piece of art. Maybe what you should have is a moment where you get to be surprised or delighted. And maybe it doesn't have to happen terribly often, but working out how to do this is actually a really hard technical problem and no one is chasing it. Because of course it's easier to keep giving you the same thing over and over again. Now, of course, there are people who are interested in these things. If you are a content producer, you actually are looking for this too. This would be how companies like HBO in America tracked content consumption globally and knew that the Housewives television reality shows were just getting to the end of being familiar and starting to be really irritating. And their decision was then to greenlight a series of quite expensive television shows because they actually thought they were at the end of a familiar, waiting to be surprised cycle, which is how we ended up with Game of Thrones. They knew that there's a moment in that cycle, but that's humans knowing, not computational objects knowing, and we don't know how to make an algorithm out of it. And of course, I guess there is the open question of whether we should. And I'm willing to imagine that is an open question. But there is something here for me of imagining what does it mean to have computation that doesn't just keep feeding us the same thing over and over again, but might allow that there are moments when we should be challenged. Or, back to that original definition of wonder, have a moment of discomfort. A moment where it isn't the familiar, but it's something unfamiliar and possibly discomforting. And then, of course, there are the challenges inside the portfolio of technologies that are AI about learning techniques. So at the moment, AI's learning techniques, usually called machine learning, are relatively straightforward. They're about introducing large sets of data to a computational object and asking it to find patterns and various forms of correlation. It's effectively a not very sophisticated form of statistics. Of course, the challenges here are about what data, what statistical modeling, what tolerance of correlations do you have? And of course, notions about how you think about these things are both incredibly instrumentalist and really straightforward. And they're not about imagining things, they're about clear, reducible patterns. And of course, none of these computational objects have a body in the traditional sense of that. How is it that we all learn things as human beings, right? Some of us in the room look like we're old enough to have gone through a period where we learned everything by rote. I'm willing to bet that's not the only way we learned. We learnt by being told the rules, and depending on your birth order, your parents, and your internal capacities, your relationship to being told the rules was to do one of two things. You went, okay, I will follow them, or, oh yeah, says who? And the reality of it is, most of us at some point said, oh yeah, says who, and broke the rules just to see what would happen. Usually not big bad rules, usually just the ones about what would happen if you didn't, well, I'd be generalizing from my own state here. What would happen if you swam within 20 minutes of eating? Turns out you don't drown. I know that now from lived experience. But we had a whole series of rules we were told, and some of them we learnt, some of them we tested by breaking them, some of them we learnt by their exceptions, some of them we did them even though they seemed irrational. How many of us in the room have spent time in Melbourne? Oh, look at, good Lord, what are you all doing here then? Or possibly that's why you're here. Pretend I didn't say that. In which case you are all deeply familiar with a hook turn. Yes, okay. You can't teach a computational object to do a hook turn because it's irrational. Autonomous vehicles have very hard time with hook turns because they just don't make any sense. But we all learnt to do them and get past the deep fear in your belly that said, why am I going around that corner this way from that lane? Won't I die? And if you didn't do it right, there was shame and embarrassment that followed you. Those are also ways we learnt, right? We didn't just learn for ourselves, we learnt by the reactions of people around us. Computational objects have a harder time doing that. They don't have bodies, they don't necessarily understand shame or embarrassment or the pleasure of getting it right. So there's something interesting about what happens when you separate out learning from embodiment. And when you think about learning, go back to that original description, right? That it was about abstractions and concepts, and it was about some notion of learning for themselves in these computational object space. But it wasn't about imagination, because frankly, think about how we teach that and don't teach that. Think about all the arguments we've had in pedagogies and schools over the last 50 years about creativity in kids, about the importance of giving kids free play, about the notion of things that weren't structured. We have a really interesting debate, in fact, often at work about how you foster creativity in humans, let alone how you might foster it in computational objects, let alone arguably the argument about whether you would want a computer to be creative. Would you want an artificial object doing that? Unclear, except for that picture. That is in fact generated by a computer. That's in fact generated by Google's deep dreaming algorithm, which was a photo manipulation algorithm, for better or worse, where you fed it images and it imagined them as though you had a subconscious, which is particularly naughty at several levels. Because if you think about what it is that Skinner, as the progenitor of notions of humanness in AI, was interested in, it was tidying up all the messiness of Freud. 1956 artificial intelligence agenda is about a notion of the humans where there is intelligence. There is none of the messiness of an id or an ego or a superego. There is no unconscious, there is no subconscious, there is none of that messy Europeanness that might have suggested that you couldn't just reduce this to a precise enough description to simulate it by a machine. And yet here we have Google at some level playing with the notion of what it would mean if a machine could dream. And is this what the dreams would look like? Take photographs and run them through this algorithm. You can do this. If you go to Google, you can use their deep dreaming algorithm to render photographs. They are weird and interesting, but also complicated for what they start to suggest about why you would want to do this, and frankly about whether we would regard this as art or not. It's an open question. Can a machine make art? And if it can, how would we feel about it? Fourth thing that AI does is sense the world around it so that it has new data. So think of this as being cameras, speakers, microphones, positioning technology. It knows where it is, it knows the temperature, it knows what it's doing. We've used all of that technology to create art in the past. It took a while before cameras were used to make photographic art, not just straight illustrations of things. But cameras quickly became a way of an artistic expression. We had people who were artists with the camera. Think Ansel Adams, think a few others. We can think of Australian versions. We know those things are true. We know in more recent times people have used next generation technology to make art. Virtual reality and augmented reality would be the obvious ones. Lynn Woolard's Collisions, which was a piece of VR work created 2 years ago, back-ended by South Australian government funding, was a piece of VR work that won awards all over the world. And it was a beautiful piece of artistic creation, making a new experience and using a new technology. Imagining how an artificial intelligent object who can see the world in a way we cannot. They have a view into the world that we don't, right? If you look at how cameras in autonomous vehicles see the world, they don't see it like the human eye, they see it in a completely different way. Will that ultimately become art? Will that ultimately create a new way of seeing the world? And is that new way of seeing the world another one of those forms of wonder? Is it about a new way in, a new point of view, a way of making the familiar unfamiliar? And if so, is that useful, good, or interesting? I don't know the answer to any of those things, but I know it's something we ought to be thinking about. And last, but by no means least, the final thing that AI usually has in it is some kind of mechanism that holds together the data, the algorithms, the learning tools, and the sensors. i.e., what's the object trying to do? Is it an autonomous vehicle? Is it a smart lift? Is it a robotic vacuum cleaner? Like, what is basically the logic that is propelling all of that activity? And of course, for the most part, the way we think about these objects is not actually about productivity and efficiency. At the moment, if you talk to my colleagues who make autonomous vehicles, they will tell you that the reason for making those is about safety. It's about improving human safety and safety on the roads. If you talk to people who make smart lifts, you know, the scary kind you go into when if you get to the lift, you push a button and it tells you what cart to go to, and when you get into the cart, there's no buttons inside of it. Am I the only person who finds... these are quite common in Sydney, not in Melbourne. But in Sydney, when you have buildings that are more than 20 to 25 stories high, the most recent ones have smart elevators. The logic behind those is about saving electricity and energy, so that what they're in fact doing is rationalising the traffic in the elevator banks by waiting for enough rides to particular floors and then assigning you to floors to work it all out. The logic there is not human comfort, the logic there is energy saving. So what back-ends these systems at the moment is a wide array of things. The notion that what that wide array might also include is making a transformative experience isn't out of bounds. We've used technology to do that before. Think about pianolas. Some of us in the room are old enough to remember those too. For those of you who aren't, a pianola is an automatic played piano. Think of it as the Jacquard loom technology, so basically a paper program sitting inside a piano that moved the keys. They were an uncanny object because the keys moved without a hand sitting in front of them, and at least in my childhood, lots of Australian pubs had them. So pianolas were definitely a form of using technology to create an experience that up until then had been human only. Pianos up until then had required people. Now, of course, they were pretty limited in what they played, and they weren't making anything new because they could only play what they were programmed to do, but there was a notion there of technology that was delivering an experience that was a creative experience. When we created cameras that didn't require f-stops anymore and let humans worry more about the image than about the technology that was happening in the background, we rationalized all that stuff too, right? So there are plenty of ways of thinking about what it might take to have this generation of technology being used for something beyond efficiency, productivity, better data collection. I use the word magic here because I think it's an important one. Arthur C. Clarke, a famous science fiction writer, a very long time ago said that any sufficiently advanced technology was indistinguishable from magic. It's the quote that's always attributed to him. Far be it for me to suggest he was wrong, but I think it is the case that one of the ways to think about that differently would be to say any sufficiently advanced technology should deliver magic. It shouldn't just be indistinguishable from it. And that in fact, one of the ways we ought to be thinking about the entire next set of generations of new technology isn't simply by reference to productivities and efficiencies. That as human beings, there are other things we care about. Maybe it's not just about wonder and art and creativity. Maybe those feel like they're indulgences. We could at least be thinking about civic engagement, participation. We could be thinking about logics of technology that weren't just about promoting businesses and business interests. There might be other ways of imagining what other questions we would ask about technical systems as they are introduced to us. Again, what is the idea of the human and the intellect that is being so precisely described that the machine can simulate it? If that's still our agenda here, and that's where new technologies are going, I'd like to imagine that the human that's being simulated in all of this is as robust as we could get, and was as varied and diverse and as interesting as human beings ultimately are. We aren't just the sum of our economic productivities, we are also people who make things and create things and hate things and love things and build things, and all of that should be part of our technical landscape too. Which means many of us in the room have a lot of work to do, because at the moment that's not the world we live in. So part of the reason I came home was to do something about all of that. I came home in no small part because I think these technical systems demand a different way of thinking about things. I took the job at the Australian National University because I wanted an opportunity to think about how did we educate the next generation of technology builders and regulators and users so that they were thinking not just about productivity and efficiency and technology specs, but also always thinking about human beings. So that means I too have a lot of work to do. So with that, I'm going to stop and say thank you.
That was magnificent. Thank you so much. I'm so inspired. Is everyone feeling inspired?
I'm just feeling tired and thinking, shit, I've got a lot of work to do.
We're not tired. We're revived. Our imagination and wonder is on fire. I think it's interesting how you're talking about seeing the world differently and that unique opportunity that we have as creatives and artists to be able to do that. And also because in the world of AR, it's been very much the utopian and dystopian viewpoints. What do you think art needs to show us about AI now that we can change it, we can reduce the fear and ignite the imagination more?
Oh, such good questions. Listen, I think one of the things that is often the place we need to start is actually being respectful of where the fear comes from. I think it's easy to dismiss fear of technology as though that were irrational. And the reality is that most technical systems have done dreadful things in addition to doing excellent things, and that in fact, it is not unreasonable to be mindful of that. And of course, with artificial intelligence in particular, our fears there are deeper than the technology. We have deep-seated, in the West at least, deep-seated cultural anxieties about what it means to bring things to life. Think Frankenstein, and before that Gollum, and then before that, every Greek, Roman, and Egyptian god story where you bring things to life and nothing good comes of it. You go from, Gollum to Frankenstein to the Terminator to Wall-E to pick a robot coming alive and killing you, or looking for John Connor to kill him, or the Doctor to kill him. I mean, there's basically just a lot of things coming to life and nothing good comes of it. Of course, the interesting reality about that is that's a cultural narrative. I spent a bunch of time in other parts of the world over the many years, and the first time I was in Japan, I was in the space precinct outside of Tokyo, and I was with some of my colleagues, and I came past a sign on a fence that said robot zone, 2 meters. I'm like, okay. And a whole lot of other words I couldn't read. And so I said to one of my colleagues, what does the sign say? And my colleague said, oh, it just says autonomous robot zone, robots 2 meters in from the curb. I'm like, well, whose robots are they? They're like, oh, they're autonomous. I'm like, well, where'd they come from? They're like, somewhere else. I'm like, well, what are they doing? They're like, they're 2 meters in from the curb. I'm like, yeah, but what? And they're like, what is your problem? I'm like, I don't understand what the robots are doing. They're like, they're autonomous. And I realized I was having one of those moments as an anthropologist where you keep asking stupid questions and people are like, how did you get to be a grown-up? Because you're really dumb. And so I try one more time. I'm like, yeah, but what are the robots doing? They're like, they're autonomous. They're doing whatever they want. Like, aren't you concerned? They're like, that's what the sign is for. And I tried one more time, and this person finally just looked at me very exasperatedly and said, what is your problem? I'm like, well, I just think in America, people would be a bit concerned that the robots were going to kill them. And this Japanese colleague of mine took an incredibly deep breath and just looked at me and went, Genevieve, that is American science fiction. Here in Japan, the robots are our friends. And I went, but the sign, they went, tells us they're 2 meters in from the curb. And I'm like, okay. And what was really striking in that moment was realizing that not all technologies are accompanied by the same narratives, right? That you could have almost exactly the same computational object and have it be seen as a partner, a friend, an object that you would trust in your home with your children, whereas the very same object in a different context was seen as the harbinger of death. And it was sort of fascinating to think about, does that liberate you to do different things? And frankly, if you look at the tradition of karakuri or automata in Japan, if you look at artistic uses of technology, you find a very different trajectory. And I don't want to kind of get into a orientalist kind of worldview there, but I think it's safe to imagine there are multiple different strands of what technology might be and how we might want to think about it. So while we in the West have been slow to realize that these were interesting objects for artistic creation, there are other places in the world that are generations ahead of us.
And it is fascinating that a large portion of what AI is used for is quite mundane, perfectly useful, and the kind of thing that we ought to be using it for if we know how to make something easier for someone.
Oh, absolutely. Though I think the challenge at the moment is that artificial intelligence feels a bit like a form of magical thinking. I mean, everyone says AI as though it were going to solve a whole series of problems, which AI cannot solve any more than humans could solve before, and if we built it, that's a kind of a knock-on problem. But the much, in some ways, more interesting question, and it's often where I end up locating my work, is to say, listen, AI, as we understand it, is the beginning of a technological transformation. It's not the end game. The best kind of bad metaphor I have in my head is that artificial intelligence is like the steam engine was 250 years ago. The steam engine was interesting. What was more interesting was when it turned into a train. And then you had to think about railways and railway systems and train lines and government rules and regulations and ideas about time and new business models. And at the moment, we're still talking about the steam engine. And I get that, because steam engines were a really big deal 250 years ago, and they were kind of amazing. But the reality is there's all this other stuff coming. And so if AI is just the beginning, this much bigger conversation is the one we need to have about what is it going to get embedded in? What are the systems it will find itself in? So not the computer screen or your television that says, here's the next Netflix thing you're going to like, but the building that is deciding the temperature of your room, or the transportation system that's deciding that your car needs to come off the road because an emergency vehicle is coming through, and oh, by the way, there's parking over there and the next train is coming. All of that is where AI is going. At the moment, it's straightforward, but the complexity that's coming is monumental.
And there just seems to be a gap. This is a bit of a leap conceptually from what you were talking about, but there's a gap in terms of the education levels around all of this with the people who are actually making decisions. So because I've stalked you endlessly over the last couple of weeks, one of the presentations that I saw you do was to government types in Victoria. And I felt like you were talking to them in English, but not English they understood. And it is very concerning that people who are working in decision-making roles are still making jokes about not understanding technology.
Oh, yes. Listen, I think one of our real challenges at multiple levels of the world is that we keep talking about the people we need to educate are the ones in primary school and high school. If we just taught primary school kids STEM and programming, everything would be taken care of. The reality is the vast majority of Australia and the planet is not in primary school. And so, I mean, maybe some of them should be, like, you know, here's a pot of clag and safety scissors. But they're not. So how we think about educating multiple layers is actually quite complicated. One of the things I had as a throwaway line in The Boy is, I keep waiting for someone to take me up on it, was basically saying that I thought much the same way we hold board directors in Australia liable for finances, and we actually have to have them be financially literate and take a course to certify themselves. I actually think there's an argument that says we should be doing the same with our political classes, not about money, but about technology. That in fact you might need to, exactly, that you might need to actually know how to think about those things. And of course, the challenge there is that it's complicated, but the reality is many of these systems need to be regulated now. We can't wait for the kids in primary school to graduate to regulate them. And throwing your hands up and saying, I don't get it, or importing complicated and expensive consultants from somewhere else doesn't help. Now, all of that said, I also think there's really different things we need to be auguring in on in how we teach primary school, high school, university, and frankly, how we do training in our companies and other places. STEM, hugely important. Learning how to program. Whatever you learn to program in now will not be relevant 10 years from now. The architecture of programs will still be relevant. So, you know, I learned to code in Pascal a bazillion years ago. People don't use that terribly often anymore, but I know how to think about how to build and read a program as a result of that. But that's not enough. We actually need to think about what are all the other pieces you need. Turns out you need to be able to have what increasingly I'm thinking of as core skills. They used to get called soft skills, but I think that misses the point. Core skills, collaboration, communication, teamwork, an ability to talk to other people who aren't like you, and an ability to be in teams of people that aren't like you. And then sitting next to that, I think a set of what sometimes gets called critical thinking, but I actually think is about how to ask the right questions.
It's all the stuff that social media is taking away from us at the moment.
Some social media is, I don't think all of it is.
I feel, are there questions in the audience? Because we have very little time left.
So that was really cheeky.
Yeah.
Do you have a really quick question? Because I've got 3.33 minutes. I'm good with yes, no.
Yes, just waiting for the microphone to come through to this gentleman in the middle here.
You touched briefly on education. I feel that I'm a techno stupe. I have no information. I can't handle a computer. The fact of the matter is I couldn't read or write until I was 14. I was a victim of the Melbourne teaching system. I am a classic dyslexic. I was forced from left to right as a child, amongst all sorts of other indignities. Can AI be used to help in the education of kids such as I was? Somewhere where a help with literacy and numeracy can be involved.
It's such a lovely question, and it's such a complicated question. For the following reason. I'm right there with you on the dyslexic, and I live in a world of acronyms. It's been an endless pain. I spell words out. I made acronyms at Intel for 20 years that were really unexpectedly bad, some of them rude, because I couldn't work out the right order to put letters in. It's an interesting problem. One of the challenges, however, with the way computation is being used in education is that, in fact, it has a real tendency towards normative thinking. So, in fact, it has a real tendency to be normative in the notion of there is one way to do things, there is a right way, and that everyone needs to be like that. So one of the challenges with how much of machine learning functions because of its background in statistics and maths is that it's remarkably inflexible. And the way most of it is being programmed and built is that it's being built around the notion of one right way to do things and one right way to see things. And you and I both know if you're a lefty in a world of right-handeds or someone for whom letters don't appear in an obvious sequence, you don't see the world the way everyone else does. So one of the challenges that we have as we think about where this computation is useful and where it isn't is also about what is the worldview we're building into it of what is human and what isn't, and how do we build variation into that, where the variation is multiple. It's about what is an appropriate body, what is an appropriate form of eyesight and hearing and capacity and skills and ways of seeing. And one of my perennial anxieties is that some of the way this technology is being created is a narrowing of the human experience, not a broadening of it. And that what we end up having is a kind of increasing specificity of what it means to be human, and it isn't you and it isn't me. And it frankly isn't a whole lot of things that would be true about Australia either, because much of it's being produced in other places where there are different ideas about culture and practice and the body and capacity. All of which means we all have an enormous amount of work to do to make sure that we find ourselves reflected in the systems around us. Which means, for better or worse, there are stories like yours we have to keep telling. And I'm glad you did, so thank you.
Thank you. Genevieve, I wish we could talk for longer, but I'm very happy to know, and I'm sure everybody else is here too, that you're in the position you're in to broaden our experience and fire our imagination and make sure that our next generation is educated properly in this field. And it's been such a pleasure hearing you speak today. Please thank distinguished Professor Genevieve Bell.